In September 2025, First Brands Group filed for bankruptcy owing more than $10 billion. It made the brake pads, oil filters, and wiper blades sitting in your garage right now. Fram, Raybestos, Trico, Anco, Autolite, 5 brand names. One collapsing company, somewhere inside its books, more than $2 billion had simply vanished. 100 million cars, give or take, depended on parts this company made. This wasn't a slow decline. It looked fine, until suddenly it wasn't. 3 weeks earlier, First Brands was still borrowing money like nothing was wrong. Wall Street banks, hedge funds, and private credit funds all had a piece of it. $10 billion in debt. That was the number everyone could agree on. Nearly every repair shop in the country relied on its brands somewhere in the chain. But another $2.3 billion in financing existed only in the shadows. At its peak, its brands sat on shelves in more than 10,000 stores. It wasn't a household name, but its products were in nearly every household. By 2024, First Brands was generating more than $5 billion a year in sales. It employed several thousand workers across factories and warehouses in North America. To understand the collapse, you have to go back to how it was built. The man behind it was Patrick James, a former distressed debt investor turned deal maker. James didn't build a factory, he built a spreadsheet and started buying companies. In 2013, he acquired Centric Parts, a small brake component supplier in California. As one industry description put it, cars break down in good economies and bad. James saw a fragmented industry, old brands, loyal customers, and almost no ambition. Raybestos, Carter, Trico, Anco, Autolite, each one bought, folded in, kept running. More than 20 acquisitions in a decade, each one bigger than the last. Private equity and private credit funded nearly every purchase along the way. The strategy had a name in finance: buy and build, buy cheap, cut costs, use cash flow to fund the next deal. The most important part of the model wasn't the parts, it was the debt. By 2020, First Brands wasn't really an auto parts company anymore. It was a debt machine that happened to make windshield wipers. And for years, that machine worked exactly as it was designed to. The biggest bet came in 2022, buying Fram filters for about $1.5 billion. Fram wasn't just a brand. Nearly every driver in America had used one of its filters. Factories ran around the clock, revenue climbed, lenders lined up for the next deal, but funding that scale of growth required something faster than ordinary bank loans. First Brands turned to private credit, the fast-growing shadow banking world that had ballooned into a $1.7 trillion industry with little regulatory oversight. Lenders eager for yield asked few questions, and First Brands took full advantage. That industry had grown past $1.5 trillion by 2024, and First Brands turned to something even less visible: receivables factoring. Factoring meant selling invoices it was owed today for cash before customers actually paid. On paper, that cash didn't count as debt. It counted as a sale, which meant it never had to appear on the balance sheet at all. It was legal, common, and made the company look healthier than it was. Factoring is a normal tool until the same invoice gets sold twice, because that, investigators would later suspect, is exactly what started happening. By 2024, First Brands was juggling billions in receivables financing across dozens of lenders. Some of those lenders had no idea the others existed. Jefferies Financial Group had exposure through a fund called Point Bonita Capital. That single fund had more than $700 million riding on First Brands paper. UBS O'Connor, a hedge fund manager, held exposure through a separate fund. Neither institution had a full picture of the debt First Brands carried. Auditors combing through the books in the summer of 2025 started finding gaps, invoices that didn't match, financing arrangements that overlapped, sometimes 2 or 3 times. By August 2025, lenders were asking questions First Brands couldn't answer cleanly. The company quietly hired restructuring advisors in the summer of 2025, months before creditors caught wind of trouble. Lawyers and turnaround specialists began combing through the books, a telltale sign that collapse was already being planned for behind. Closed doors, rarely a good sign. Within weeks, the conversation shifted from refinancing to outright survival. Analysts would later count 5 compounding mistakes behind the collapse. The first, a decade of acquisitions funded almost entirely with borrowed money. The second, off-balance sheet factoring that hid billions from lenders and auditors alike. On September 29, 2025, First Brands filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy in Texas. The filing listed liabilities somewhere between $10 and $50 billion, a stunning range because nobody, including the company, seemed to know the real number. The third, the same customer invoices appeared pledged to more than one lender. Thousands of jobs across dozens of factories were suddenly hanging in the balance. The fourth, a private credit industry that had grown too fast to police itself. Nobody was asking the boring questions because the boring questions don't get you paid. First Brands wasn't the first to exploit that gap, just the biggest one caught, following a pattern seen in smaller private credit blowups over the past 2 years. Regulators had been warned repeatedly, but enforcement never caught up to the money. And the fifth, a liquidity crunch that hit before anyone could unwind the mess. Once one lender demanded its money back, all of them did, at once. That's how a company with $5 billion in revenue runs out of cash. And when the cash finally ran out, it ran out for everyone at once. To keep the factories running, First Brands needed emergency cash immediately. Courts approved debtor-in-possession financing, a loan that jumps ahead of nearly everyone else. Lenders agreed to provide over $1 billion just to keep operations alive. It meant paychecks still cleared, production lines kept moving for now. For factory workers, bankruptcy looked, for the moment, like an ordinary Tuesday. The lights stayed on. The debt behind the lights did not. But DIP financing buys time. It doesn't erase what's owed. Jefferies' stock fell sharply once its exposure through Point Bonita became public. UBS moved to restrict withdrawals from the fund tied to First Brands. Some of that money belonged to pension funds and insurers, several steps removed. People who had never heard the name First Brands were suddenly holding its losses. Regulators and prosecutors opened inquiries into how the financing had actually been structured. Across the private credit industry, similar blowups had already surfaced by 2025. The industry had grown by lending to companies banks considered too risky to touch. First Brands simply became the loudest example of a much quieter problem. Comparisons to Greensill Capital, the lender that collapsed in 2021, came immediately. Both companies turned debt into something that didn't look like debt. Both worked brilliantly, right up until the moment they didn't. History doesn't repeat, but leverage always rhymes. Employees at Raybestos, Trico, and Fram plants kept showing up to work anyway. The parts still needed to be made. The bankruptcy was happening several floors above them. That contrast, factories running while the finance behind them collapsed, was the whole story. Its brands, worth billions combined, were expected to be sold off in pieces. The bankruptcy filing ran past 1,000 pages, and still, no agreed total. Go back to that number. $10 billion in debt and $2 billion more nobody could find. That gap wasn't a rounding error. It was the entire business model hidden in plain sight. Every car on the road today still needs the parts First Brands made. First Brands didn't fail because people stopped buying brake pads and windshield wipers. It failed because for over a decade, almost nobody asked where the cash came from. Private credit was supposed to be the safer alternative to Wall Street. First Brands proved otherwise. Cheap money doesn't ask hard questions. It just keeps flowing until someone finally does. First Brands spent a decade making sure nobody did. In the end, the parts were real. The debt was only ever as real as the paperwork said it was.